Evening. I was talking to the Rav at Kiddush a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, in Yonah, everyone's speaking about the same issues, discussing. It's not classic probably, but everything that we're experiencing, all of it is laid out almost from this first or second pasuk in the Torah, through Chazal, through Nevi'im, through the views of Gedolei Yisroel, and obviously we stand today in a very great Eis Tzarah. It's not a new one, but it's arguably a worse one. In Eretz Yisrael, the Tzarah started as soon as the Declaration of Independence happened. Wars initially against nation states, 1948, 56, 67, 73. That's what you have in a societal level. Nations fight each other for land. It's nothing exceptional. But starting in the early 1960s, this evolved way past that from nations to non-state militias, terrorist groups, and long before 1967. So it's not just the victory in 67 spawned that. This was already happening in the 60s. And outside of sporadic periods of quiet, which the Arabs used to reorganize and rearm, we have seen a steady deterioration Yishmael against us. Giant and growing militias inside and outside of Eretz Yisrael with ever-increasing weapons and arsenals of destruction. We see these militias, they keep growing, and not just in Gaza, and not just in Lebanon, but we see it in Syria. We see what's going on the last few weeks, and in Iraq, and the Iranian areas that are loyal to them. Yemen, Yemen before a couple of years ago when the rebels started being armed. And Lamai said maybe this round with the Eibishter's help of fighting will neutralize the threat of Hamas in Gaza. But even if that happens, ideology is not going to disappear. And it's one branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not everything. And there certainly is no sign that anyone is addressing Iran, which, as we know, is the head of the snake. And all of these are just derivative of the Iranians. And quite the opposite. On a geopolitical level broadly, things are getting worse because we've seen the formation over the past year and a half of a new and extremely treacherous axis of evil among Iran and Russia and China. Famous story in the aftermath of a devastating earthquake in Japan in 1923 that killed 100,000 people. Chafetz Chaim heard about it, he shuddered and he declared a public kindness and issued a kol kara to do tshuva, on the view that anything that happens in the world, even an earthquake in Japan that doesn't have a Jew near it, happens because of Am Yisrael. And therefore, what's the lesson to us? When Russia invaded Ukraine early in 2022, we looked at it and we said, terrific, Pax and Lobell houses. You had two bands of vicious anti-Semites fighting each other. Let them kill each other. We should have known better. Russia proves itself to be inept in drone technology and therefore buddies up with Iran as its technology provider. China sees Ukraine as a watershed battle between the ascending East and the declining West. And it looks at Ukraine as important. And now, because nothing happens outside of the fact that it happens to Am Yisrael, we bear the burden of that war also, and that has an important impact on what we're seeing in Eretz Yisrael now. But the challenge is not only in and around Eretz Yisrael, because the Muslim population is expanding all over the world. Birth rates have collapsed in most Western countries, and the need for replacement workers, coupled with very loose immigration policies in Europe and elsewhere, have led to explosions in the Muslim population. Some of the data I picked up is already probably dated by now, but it said that there are more than 75 million Arabs in the EU, 60 or more % of the babies born in Denmark are Muslim, 40% of the babies in Germany, 25% of the babies in the UK. What's the most common baby name in any of these countries? Muhammad, of course, not just for Uber driver apps. You have public fasts in these countries for Ramadan, because since it's so important, at least one of the 3 days at the end of Ramadan has to be a celebration that's public, accommodations in schools, and everyone's afraid of them. And the Muslims have made it very clear they're not going to integrate, that's not what they're here for, but they're here to grow, to take over, to expunge the history of the indigenous peoples, and eventually to impose Sharia law. That's what the Quran requires, and that's what they've been very clear they're going to do. Now, even in areas where Muslim growth has not been as dramatic, for example, here in the United States, we see that growth coming, and we see the last few weeks an explosion of support for terror and anti-Semitism among an increasingly militant and violent left wing. And inexplicably, every perverse left-wing cause, whether it's BLM and transgenders and LGBTQ plus, minus, or equals, all of them are championing barbaric terrorists who stand in opposition to all of those causes. The world has been a place of sheker and sinas Yisrael for a long time, and certainly throughout the Elef HaShishi. Long before Jews started to return en masse to Eretz Yisrael. But now that we are in Eretz Yisrael, and now that we have to defend ourselves in and around Eretz Yisrael, you see the big lie machine of the media and left-wing academics, coupled with toxic social media, delivers us lower and greater and lower lows and incomprehensible outcomes. How can we even contemplate what's happening today? Israel getting blamed for the heinous massacre of its own babies. And how is it possible that the most educated Westerners, perhaps not differently than the most educated Germans in the 1930s, embrace serial killers who despise them? None of this is possible if the Eibishter didn't will it to be. But why is he willing it to be? On the one hand, this is behavior we expected of Edom. Murder, pogroms, gas chambers, Holocaust. These are the armaments and the toolkits of Edom. When Eibishter went to the nations asking them, do you want to accept Eretz Yisrael? Edom says, not interested. We can't live without killing people. But it wasn't always that way with Yishmael. They said, oh, Haslo Signo, we're out of the game. Because that's what we are. We're thieves. We steal things from people. We abuse people. We're crooks. We're liars. We're Arafat in his Swiss bank accounts. And even Hamas, with all the murders, apparently has $11 billion in Swiss money. That's what the Arabs were for many generations. The Jews that were in Arab countries up until recently certainly treated, I think it's pronounced dhimmis, second-class citizens, functional slaves to the Muslims, but we were robbed much more than we were killed. Under Arabs, at least at different points in time, Jews were able to flourish. Use the word golden ages. I don't think any of these were really golden ages, but it was better in many cases than the living conditions that we had under the Christians. Jews were the doctors, the financiers, and some of the courts in Spain and in North Africa. Once it was conquered by the Christians, we landed up with inquisitions and executions and exiles. But over the past 100 years, and specifically over the past 60 years or so, as Jews started resettling Eretz Yisrael, there has been a dramatic shift among Muslims to out-and-out murderers. Started most prolifically with the Hebron massacre in 1929, the genocidal plans of the Grand Mufti, and slowly this mantle of the lead executioner of the Jews shifted from the Christians to the Muslims, from Edom to Yishmael. Rav Moshe Shapiro Zatzal, who really is my Rebbe in all of these inyanim for 20 or 30 years, heard shiurim speaking about these inyanim, speaking about Acharis Hayamim. He said that while we face persecutions in every generation, today's conduct, and he was niftar several years ago, but he was saying this starting 15 years ago, the conduct today is more fearsome and scary than ever before, because Muslims are willing to give up their lives on suicide missions. This is something we've never seen before. The willingness, even the exhilaration of mothers to cry tears of happiness that their sons are being slaughtered on the altar of death, as long as they take enough Jews with them, is a mind-boggling concept. Never saw that. There's no precedent in history for behavior like that. Yeah, Malik attacked us recklessly when we came out of Mitzrayim at the apex of our height, but that was still a nation trying to protect itself in theory. Yes, there's hatred, and you're not going to forget who Amalek is, but there was still land that the Bnei Yisrael were coming to conquer. None of this exists right now. There were never recruiting centers for suicide bombers with promises of promiscuity and the afterlife. And all of this emerged out of the blue in our generation. How do we understand that? Importantly, how do we deal with it? The purpose of tonight's discussion, and as I said to the Rav, this subject is so dense, it needs a few sessions to do justice to it. But tonight, and eventually, is how do we contextualize through Chazal and through the Nevi'im, how do we understand Galus Yishmael? Tonight, we want to know what is the source of that, and specifically, is Galus Yishmael part of the Dalet Galuyos, or is it independent of them? Next week, if people have me and listen, we'll explore what is it that's so unique and dangerous about Yishmael in this Galus that evokes such fear. Third session is, what is it that Jews are supposed to do? It's not the first time we've had Tzarah. What do Chazal tell us? How do we act? When do we fight? When do we daven? When do we do both? What type of tefillah is it that's going to save us, and how are we supposed to react? And finally, it's worth having a last session exploring how this war with Yishmael, this Galus Yishmael, fits into the sequence of Acharis Hayamim, including Milchemes Gog uMagog, including Bias HaMashiach, and even Tchias HaMesim. The imperative that Klal Yisrael endure 4 Galuyos prior to our Geula is not something we just noticed. It was ingrained from the first words of Ma'aseh Bereishis. Explains the Medrash B'Shem Rish Lakish on the second pasuk in the Torah, Ya Bereishis Bara Elokim, describing the world after that. V'ha'aretz hayosah sohu, says Chazal, sohu is Bavel, as it says in Yirmiyah, Re'isi es ha'aretz v'hinei sohu. Vavohu, that refers to Paras Umadai. Pasuk tells us, Vayavhilu l'haviyas Haman. V'choshech, zuhi Galus shenish, I'll say it, that was machashech us as eineim shel Yisrael b'gzeresayim. This is Yaman, where they darkened our perspective by extinguishing or trying to extinguish the Or HaTorah. Al Pnei Sahom refers to Galus Edom, the final Galus, which is Ad Ein Cheker, deep as the abyss of the Tahom. And once we complete these 4 Galuyos, all reflected in the second pasuk, V'ruach Elikim merachefes al Pnei Hamayim, as the pasuk says in Yeshaya, V'nocha olav Ruach Hashem, because in the aftermath of the Galuyos, in the aftermath of our tshuva, the Ruach Elikim, the Shechina, the Mashiach, will hover over us for eternity. It's set forth, ordained from the original creation of the world. 2 weeks ago, we read in Parshas Lech Lecha how in order to secure the release of a hostage, obviously Maisa Av is Siman Labanim of what we are fighting for today, Avram went to war with 4 kings. Explains the Medrash, these aren't 4 random kings, but these are kings who expressly represent the 4 subsequent Galuyos that we're going to have. Albeit, in the pasuk at least, not in chronological order. Amraphel, who Rashi tells us is Nimrod, who was the leader of the world, the Dor HaFlaga, was the leader of this war also. And just as he led the Dor HaFlaga, he led this, and Amraphel is the king, we say Melech Shinar, which the Gemara tells us is another name for Bavel. Aryoch, Melech Elasar, Aryoch, says Chazal, is Antiochus, the king of Yavin. Kedar LaOmer refers to Paras Umadai. Sid al Melech Goyim refers to Edom Amalchus, that casts its tyranny over many nations. We won't go through each of these, but Chazal explains similarly how each of the objects that were part of the bris bein habesarim that Avram used to be kairos, that important bris, each one related to one of the 4 Galuyos. And likewise, Yaakov's dream, Rihine Sulam, Mutzav Arza, what Yaakov was looking at the Makam HaMikdash, elucidated the 4 Galuyos that his children would eventually traverse. Now, to overlap in Yonah D'Yoma with more in Yonah D'Yoma, we started Bava Kamala Shabbos with the Arba Avos Nezikin. In the Shir I heard referenced a pshat from the Pri Tzadik, from Reb Tzadok HaKaim. Gemara in Shabbos Lamed Aleph cites the pasuk in Yeshaya, V'hoya ema emunas itecha chaysin Yeshuas chochmas v'das yiras Hashem ki Eis Tzarah. That this pasuk refers to the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. Emunas is Rayim Itecha, as it indicates, is Moed. Chosen is Nashim. Yeshuas is Seder Nezikin. Why Yeshua's? Because the 4 Avos Nezikin, in addition to being the primary categories of Niskei Mamon, also represent the 4 Galuyos from which we will eventually be Nigal. And for that reason, Nezikin is going to bring the Geula because it represents the Seder Yeshua's. Ayin as well in the Hakdama to the Chassam Sofer and Bava Kama, and the Psicha, the Hakdama, is basically as long as the whole Pirush of the Chassam Sofer. Outside of Likutim, it only goes up to Daf Hey, where Shalei Kedarke, the Hakdama, is entirely Al Pi Nister. The Chassam Sofer cites the Ramami Pano from the Maimer Chikar Adin, in which he asks several basic Nezikin type kashas from the beginning of Bava Kama and answers all of them Al Pi Nister by understanding these are the Galuyos from which Klal Yisrael will be Nigal. Now, why is it that it's so important to our evolution that we have to have 4 Galuyos? Who said there has to be four Galuyos, and what's the purpose of it that the Eibush just sends us there? In the different Mahalchim. It's not tonight's topic, but briefly in the Michtav Miliar, Dessler explains that when Klal Yisrael is infected with a very bad midah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Barachamim, sends us to an exile where we are shown what that midah looks like in its worst manifestation. And after the Lashon Hara that was spoken about Yosef, we're sent to Mitzrayim because that midah can only be fixed by Paro, the Avi Avos of Diburah, who is referred to as a dog. The Gemara tells us at the end of Psachim that anybody who speaks or receives, accepts Lashon Hara is fit to be thrown to the dogs. And Rav Dessler explains how that works with other Galuyos. We needed to have it for that reason. The Maral and Chanukah and the Ner Mitzvah says that the 4 Galuyos are needed for the development of Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebaal Peh. We needed Bavel to destroy the Beis HaMikdash because of our Chatayim, but then gave us a venue in Bavel to begin the explication of Torah Shebaal Peh. Paras was needed for Kimu V'Kiblu, to re-accept Torah Shebechsav after Haman. Yaman for the reaffirmation of Torah Shebaal Peh after the downfall of Yaman in Greece, and finally Edom to serve as the bridge to the Melech HaMashiach. But whatever the reason for having 4 Galuyos, at least in these several sources, no mention of Yishmael. Yishmael isn't associated with these 4 Galuyos, which would suggest that perhaps Galus Yishmael is distinct from the Dalet Galuyos. On the other hand, let's reflect briefly on some of the other sources that make explicit reference to the Geferlich Tzarahs, worst of any Galus that we are going to experience during Galus Yishmael, that seems to be part of the sequence of Dalet Galuyos. One primary source comes from the name, the actual proper name of Yishmael. The Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar, as many of you are familiar, it's 54 prakim of otherwise unpublished Memrei Chazal that's authored by Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And he writes in Lamed Beis, there's 6 individuals whose names were preordained to be their names before they were born, of which one of them is Yishmael. We know the sequence. Sarah didn't have a child. She wasn't able to conceive. She gave Hagar, who she acquired from Paro, ironically, in Mitzrayim, to Avram. She quickly became pregnant. Vatekal Gavir to B'Yineh. Sarah shepherded her. She miscarried. She ran away. And then the Malach told her, go back, Hagar, go back to Avram. You're going to have another child. You're going to have a son. And you're going to call him Yishmael because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has listened to your prayer. But if Hashem listened to her prayer in the past tense, when the baby was born, he should have been called Shoma Kale. God listened to you. Why Yishmael? That God will listen to you. And this mystery applies with even greater force vis-a-vis Avram Avinu. There's no indication that this nevuah of Hagar, the discussion that she had with the Malach, was known to Avram Avinu. Yet when Yishmael was born, the pasuk tells us that Abraham independently named him Yishmael. Now, if Avram didn't know what the Malach Hashem said to Hagar, he couldn't have named him Yishmael, leaving aside the grammatical inaccuracy, because Hashem listened to Hagar. Rather, explains the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, Avram Avinu called him Yishmael, quote, She'aseh HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'shmaya b'kol nakas ha'am. In the future, eventually, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to hear our naka, no differently than in Mitzrayim. He's going to hear our tears, going to hear our cries. Mimasha asidim b'nei Yishmael laseis ba'aretz b'Acharis Hayamim. Because in the Acharis Hayamim, when we return to Eretz Yisrael, and Jews around the world will be in fact impacted by Yishmael. We cry out to Hakadosh Baruch Hu from that oppression. Hakadosh Baruch Hu will listen to us, and that's why he was called Yishmael, not because of him, not because the Malach listened to Hagar, but because Hakadosh Baruch Hu will listen to us as a result of what he will do to us. And the Pirkei cites the pasuk in Tehillim Nun Hey Shenemar Yishmael v'Ya'anem. This is foretold already at the time of Yishmael's birth. Another source, however, unlikely for the travails of Galus Yishmael is the Kolos of Bilam HaRasha. And the Pirkei of Rabbi Elazar explains that of the 70 nations that are created, only Yisrael carries the Shem Hashem of Kel. And Kel is indicative of unusual potency. As Lobell says, Yesh la el yodi lasaisi machem ra, that I am inclined to use the power of my hand to do wrong to you, Yaakov Avinu. And Bilam's nebuah is that insofar as Yishmael, while it doesn't have the name Kel to the same extent as Yisrael, but the shoresh is in there, Oy, mi yichya misumo. And the emotive word Oy has no translation. It's what it feels like. It's a krech. It's asking who is it that could possibly withstand the despicable violence and the oppression of Yishmael during his ascendancy, Acharis Hayamim, that he is allowed to do because he carries this fearsome quality of Kel. Pirkei Rabbi Elazar also identifies a series of actions that Yishmael will undertake against us at the end of days. He mentions 15. Many of these have happened. Examples include spreading nonsensical sheker that other nations will believe. Look at the news the last few weeks. Doing construction in the Har HaBayis to remove evidence of any presence there. Expunging history is something Yishmael traffics in, as we see at the time of Acharis Hayamim. Defacing, spreading garbage in, trying to erase Jewish cemeteries. See that throughout the Middle East. The Zohar at the end of Parshas Ve'era relates a dialogue between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Chia, who are walking together, and they ask each other, as they always would, to recite words of Torah. And the Zohar explains, and it's brought down in the Pirkei also, Rabbi Chia is shedding tears when he cites the pasuk of Eis Tzarah Kara in love a lot. It's the worst pasuk in the Torah, the scariest pasuk to think about, because it led to Hagar and it led to Yishmael. Yossi asked Rabbi Chia, what's so terrible about it? I mean, yes, he had Yishmael, but Avinu was still Zeicha afterwards to have Yitzchak, and the brachas are niskayim through Yitzchak. And answers Rabbi Chia, no, I hear it the way you hear it, but I heard from Rabbi Shimon, meaning Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, lamenting that Sarah's delay, that Hakadosh Baruch Hu's determination that he wanted the tefillah of the imos, that delay led to the worst catastrophe that Klal Yisrael is going to have. Because it led to Hagar and it led to Yishmael, and because Yishmael is able to petition for Zechusim as a direct descendant of the Avraham and Goyim, woe to Klal Yisrael for what Yishmael will do to us in Eretz Yisrael at the time of Mashiach. The Igeres Teiman, fascinating document, and if you haven't read it, it's Kedai, it's on Sefaria, it's published, was written by the Rambam in response to a letter to him from the Yemenite community in the year 1172. And after the Rambam fled Spain, he lived in Morocco for a while, went to Eretz Yisrael, couldn't make a living in Eretz Yisrael, went to Egypt, Alexandria, then to Cairo, lived there for 40 years, was nifted then in 1204. And the Igeres was written originally in Arabic 6 years after he arrived in Cairo, and it states, among many fascinating things, that our suffering from Yishmael during Chevlei HaMashiach is predestined, akin to the pain of a mother during Chevlei Leda. And the Rambam laments that living under the rule of Yishmael, both then, throughout history, but certainly at the time of Mashiach, is terrifying. He says, this is a nation that wants to harm us and minimize us and cause every other nation to despise us. So we always put up with their lies, we put up with the subjugation, even though it is so hard to accept something so far from the truth. And he diagnoses, as a physician would, the Muhammad and the epileptic insanity that he suffers from. And he writes that, interestingly, that so long as we try to make peace with these people and negotiate with us, it'll never work. They will just chase after us for more war. And that because our suffering from Yishmael will be so acute prior to Bias HaMashiach, he cites the Memra, that we should definitely daven for Mashiach, but we should be zeichet to be fortunate that it not arrive during our lifetime. This is something the Rambam wrote 900 years ago. Could have written it yesterday. Reb Chaim Vital, the foremost Talmud of the Arizal, wrote a Pirush on Tehillim called Eis Tzarah. And he, in Fataich's Kapitel Kuf Dalet, is a prophecy of a final war against Yishmael. David HaMelech, he explains, foresaw this existential Muhammad that would extend beyond Shmad and dominion to annihilation and extinction of an entire people. The first pasuk in the kapitel refers to Dalet Galuyos, and when the second pasuk in the kapitel refers to Adam, he says it's referring to Para Adam. We'll discuss what that means next week. Shelley flagged that to me before we started. Who will seek to push us into the sea and swallow us whole. And unlike other tormentors who initially wanted us to reject our religion, that's not what Yishmael's about, certainly not now. He seeks to destroy our history, our identity, as if it never existed. And therefore, Galus, Yishmael, says, Chaim Vital, citing the Rizal, will be harsher than every other Galus. We'll analyze next week what is it about Yishmael that gives him that koyach to be so deadly, to be so dangerous to us. So now that we've seen both of these series of sources, how do we reconcile the fact that there are many sources of Chazal that speak about the Dalet Galuyos and make no mention of Yishmael, Masha'in Kain, other sources that foretell the horrific punishment that awaits us from Galus Yishmael upon Acharis Hayamim. In our working thesis, which is really the punchline of tonight's discussion that we'll try to develop with proof next week, is that of course Galus Yishmael exists. But it doesn't exist as an independent Galus, but it exists rather as an outgrowth, an extension of Galus Edom that serves as the bridge from Galus Edom to our odyssey back to Eretz Yisrael and to Bias HaMashiach. And this concept of bridge is crucial because it will explain so much how Yishmael bridges animals to men. Now Galus Yishmael bridges us from normal events to Bias HaMashiach. How do we know this is the case? How do we know there is such a thing as a Galus Yishmael being an extension to Galus Edom? And we'll conclude with this one nevuah. It's from the famous nevuah from Daniel that he explained 2,400 years ago in Daniel Beis. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about a Tzuras Adam in the form of a four-part statue that was opposed by the Tzuras Adam representing Klal Yisrael. And he asked Daniel, what does this mean? How do I understand this? And Daniel explained, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is showing to you the history of Klal Yisrael and where you fit into it. Because the golden head in the dream is Bavel. The silver neck, Lefi one day, is Paras. The two arms, according to another day, Daniel was somewhat cagey with how he described who's going to take over in Pasuk Gimel, over there from Pasuk Lamentes and Kapitel Beis of Daniel. So whether it's the neck, whether it's the arms, that's going to be Paras Umadai. The body of copper in the Nebuah is grease. And as for the two legs, he says, one leg which is made of iron, that's Edom. The other leg made of clay is Yishmael. And asks Reb Sadia Gaon, the Rambam actually cites this as well, and then Yigeres Teiman, he says, why were the first Galuyos, the first three Galuyos, symbolized by a single body part, whereas the Galus of Edom / Yishmael presents as two separate legs? And Reb Sadia explains that at the end of Malchus Edom, the separate powers of Esav and Yishmael will join against us by coalescing into one. And this is the great danger that we face. Because whereas hands can operate independently, legs are not fully functional unless both work in unison. Now, iron and clay are not natural materials that combine easily. And therefore, he explains that this will be a kingdom, as we see, that will have ups and downs. It will alternately reflect great strength and at other times instability. We are witnessing today what Reb Sadia wrote 1,200 years ago. And woe to us that we must endure this fusion of Esav and Yishmael. Woe to us that the evil and hatred that festered in Edom for 2,000 years has been transitioned to Yishmael in a virulent form that the world has never seen. In all the years of the Holocaust, Hitler never allowed a foreign head of state to see the camps, to see Auschwitz. One exception. The Grand Mufti, who I think was the grandfather of the present king of Jordan, the father of King Hussein, he came to Germany, made a pact with Hitler. He says, I'll let you go see it because you're going to enjoy this. And in a way, you are the successor to what I'm doing. What we're doing here, Rommel wasn't able to do in El Alamein, which was a miracle in itself. But ultimately, this baton gets passed to you. And in some ways, it has. In some ways, after the Holocaust, we can go anywhere, and Jews aren't infringed physically almost in any other nation. I'm not saying they love us, but we're not getting persecuted. The Galus of Edom, in many ways, stopped with the Holocaust. But as soon as it did, that's a broad statement, but it certainly waned with the Holocaust. But as soon as it did, it picked up with Galus Yishmael, which became the primary tormentor of us. Next week, we'll discuss when and why this transition from Esav to Yishmael occurred, and more importantly, what is the source of Yishmael's immense power. Now, ominous though this sounds, I don't want to end on such a foreboding note. The good news is that we know this story can and will have a happy ending, because we are promised, as we noted in the Pirkei D'Rabbi Eliezer, that Akadosh Baruch Hu will listen to us when we properly try to cry out to him from the tzaras of Yishmael. But properly cry is what we need to explore and understand. As Rav Moshe often said when he ended shiurim on this subject, he says, Yishmael has more than done his part of Galus Yishmael. It's time for us to do ours, and let's be smart enough to cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu now, before Yishmael inflicts greater damage. And on that basis, be zocheh to bias HaMashiach b'karav. Amen.